the stretchy face and arms, and the easy physical comedy that made people laugh for years. For almost 100 years, Dick Van Dyke has been one of the most beloved names in entertainment. The perfect nice guy, whose friendliness and charm are just as natural off-screen as they are on. Van Dyke has been working for 8 decades and is now 98 years old. Behind that megawatt smile, he has started to show signs of a more complicated life. When the cameras stopped rolling, the man who danced on roofs as Bert the chimney sweep and fell over ottomans as Rob Petrie wasn't always so happy. Van Dyke sometimes had problems with co-workers whose ideas or methods were different from his own. This is normal for artists who are very passionate about their work. A longtime friend who worked with Van Dyke on TV said that Dick has always been careful about how he looks in public. He wants to bring happiness, not trouble. But when he's alone, he's always had strong feelings about the right and wrong ways to be funny, act professionally, and be an artist. And sometimes the smile went away when those values were questioned. Hollywood gossip is mostly about explosive fights, but Van Dyke's problems show something more subtle. The quiet anger of a sincere perfectionist working in a field where people don't always share his values. His arguments weren't based on ego or smallness. They were based on a strong belief that entertainment should elevate instead of lower, include instead of exclude. Now that he's 100 years old and has had an amazing career, Van Dyke is starting to see the sometimes dark sides of his happy public persona. These include creative differences, professional disappointments, and personal tensions that, while not defining his journey, did shape it in ways fans never thought possible. These are the 6 people who, for different reasons, put Dick Van Dyke's famously good nature to the test and showed the fierce drive that lay beneath the song and dance. 6. A TV critic who doesn't want to be named. The review he would never forget. For an artist with a career that spans almost 80 years, it may seem strange that one bad review could have such a big effect. But a critic's negative review in 1961 got through Dick Van Dyke's usually impenetrable positivity, making it one of the few times the famous entertainer held a real, long-lasting grudge. As the first season of the Dick Van Dyke Show was getting going, a well-known TV critic, Van Dyke has never said the name of the critic, wrote a harsh review that called the show too light and easily forgettable. A talent who was nice enough, but doesn't have enough depth to carry a series. Van Dyke had worked very hard to move from radio to Broadway to TV, so this evaluation hit him right where it hurt the most. He was afraid that people would think his clean-cut approach to comedy was missing in depth or sophistication. A writer from the show remembered that review coming at a bad time. We were still getting used to each other. The numbers weren't great, and Dick was putting a lot of pressure on himself to make the show work. It was like someone told him he didn't have what it takes. It hurt a lot. The most interesting thing about this story is not that Van Dyke was hurt by criticism. Most performers are. What's interesting is that this review stuck with him through decades of success, praise, and cultural effect. Van Dyke almost admitted to still being angry in his 2011 autobiography, My Lucky Life in Out of Show Business. He wrote, "I've forgotten most of the reviews, good and bad, but that one stayed with me. I still wonder what that critic would say about how forgettable my career turned out to be 50 years later." At a TV Academy event in the 1990s, I was with Dick when this critic's name was mentioned briefly. Even though Dick is usually the nicest person you could meet, he had this look on his face that wasn't quite anger, but a quiet determination. He said, "Well, I guess we proved him wrong, didn't we?" That was the most "I told you so" I've ever heard him say. Producer who worked with Van Dyke on several projects. This criticism was especially hard for Van Dyke to ignore because it directly tested the way he planned to be funny. Unlike performers whose careers were built on being edgy or causing trouble, Van Dyke decided to be friendly and easy to talk to. Being told that choice was a problem instead of a strength made him feel like people didn't understand what he was trying to do with his art. It felt good to know that the Dick Van Dyke Show became one of the most famous and influential sitcoms of all time, and that it is still studied in film schools and referred to by current creators. But the fact that Van Dyke still can't get over being thrown out early shows something important about his character. There is a serious artist behind the easy smile and friendly demeanor. He cares a lot about his reputation and the legitimacy of his artistic choices. Van Dyke's job is to make other people happy, so this rare glimpse of lingering hurt makes him more real than his polished public image usually lets him, inspiring us to remember that even the happiest people have bad days, and that artists who make us happy look easy are probably working harder than we think. He leads movies much better than he acts. I've seen his work. The fifth person is Walter Matthau. When different personalities clash. When Dick Van Dyke and Walter Matthau met on stage in 1964, it was a great example of how different things can be. Van Dyke, with his boundless energy and never-ending positivity. Matthau, who was cynical and grumbled because he had seen too much of the world. Their short work relationship showed how much Van Dyke's famously long patience could handle, and how strongly his performance philosophy was rooted in his personal beliefs. The show was a short run of a comedy in a theater in Los Angeles. It happened at the same time that the Dick Van Dyke Show was already a big hit on TV. Van Dyke jumped at the chance to go back to the stage because he loves to do theater work when he's not working on TV shows. At first, the idea of working with Matthau, who was already known as a great serious and comedic actor, excited him. Reality turned out to be harder than expected. From the first practice, there was tension between them because they had very different ideas about how to be funny and how to be professional. A stage manager from the show remembered that they looked like aliens from other worlds. Dick always got there early, knew everyone's name, and was full of energy. Walter would show up at the last minute, complain about everything, and go into every scene with this cynical, world-weary attitude that was clever, but didn't go with anything. Timing and tone were the main sources of stress. Matthau's style was more improvised and unpredictable, which was hard for Van Dyke, whose humor was precise, rehearsed, and carefully crafted. Matthau, on the other hand, thought Van Dyke's constant happiness and careful planning were a little odd, and he was said to have said this in a very rude way during breaks. I once saw Dick sitting alone backstage and looking irritated in a way that wasn't like him. When I asked what was wrong, he just sighed and said, "Walter is brilliant and exhausting. I never know if we're doing the scene we rehearsed or something he just invented." It wasn't anger in his voice, but a kind of puzzled disappointment, like he couldn't understand why anyone would choose to make the process harder than it needed to be. Costume designer who worked on the production. The breaking point came during a particularly crucial comedic scene. According to those present, Matthau repeatedly changed his delivery and timing, making it impossible for Van Dyke to build the rhythmic flow he considered essential to effective comedy. After several frustrated attempts to adapt, Van Dyke finally pulled the director aside and requested a clear decision on how the scene should be played. It wasn't a tantrum. Dick doesn't do tantrums, the stage manager clarified. It was simply him reaching the limits of his flexibility. He basically said, "Either we rehearse this properly, or I don't see how I can make it work for someone as adaptable as Dick." That was the equivalent of another actor throwing a chair. The production ultimately succeeded despite these behind-the-scenes tensions, receiving positive reviews that particularly noted the interesting contrast between the two performers' styles. Van Dyke and Matthau maintained professional courtesy throughout the run, but never worked together again. A mutual decision that reflected their recognition of fundamentally incompatible creative approaches. Years later, when asked about difficult colleagues, Van Dyke would occasionally reference this experience with a diplomatic formula that those who knew the situation understood perfectly. Some brilliant performers have challenging processes. I've always preferred to keep things light and collaborative, but there's more than one way to create good work. For Van Dyke, the Matthau experience crystallized something he had always intuitively understood, that his preference for positivity and preparation wasn't just a personality trait, but a professional philosophy. His discomfort with Matthau's approach wasn't personal resentment, but a genuine belief that comedy works best when built on trust, consistency, and mutual support, rather than tension and unpredictability. Number 4. CBS Studio Executives. The battle for his show's survival. Behind the scenes of the Dick Van Dyke Show, now considered one of television's most perfect sitcoms, lay a tense, ongoing struggle between creative vision and network anxiety. The conflict between Dick Van Dyke and CBS executives during the show's early days reveals a less familiar side of the ever-smiling performer, the determined artist willing to fight for his work, even to the point of considering walking away from the opportunity that would define his career. When the show premiered in October 1961, it represented a significant departure from the standard domestic sitcoms of the era. Creator Carl Reiner had crafted a more sophisticated comedy that balanced home and work life, featured realistic characters, rather than broad stereotypes, and trusted the audience's intelligence rather than explaining every joke. While this approach would eventually be recognized as revolutionary, initial ratings were concerning, and CBS executives began pressuring for changes. They wanted more slapstick, more obvious jokes, more traditional sitcom elements. Remembered, a writer from the show's first season? They kept saying the show wasn't relatable enough for middle America, that viewers wouldn't understand the comedy if it wasn't broader. Dick took this criticism personally because the show's approach reflected his own comedic values. The network's feedback often focused on Van Dyke himself, suggesting his character should be more of a bumbling father figure in the tradition of other sitcom dads, rather than the relatively competent, nuanced character Reiner had created. 4. Van Dyke, who had fought to be taken seriously as more than just a physical comedian, these suggestions felt like a fundamental misunderstanding of what made the show special. There was one meeting where a network executive suggested they add a catchphrase that Dick would say every episode, something like, "Well, what do you know about that?" complete with a silly hand gesture. Dick just stared at him for a long moment, then very politely said, "I think that would undermine everything we're trying to achieve." The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. It was the politest rejection of a bad idea I've ever witnessed. Production assistant who worked on the first season. The situation reached a critical point when CBS, concerned about the modest ratings, considered canceling the show after its first season. Van Dyke, along with Reiner and producer Sheldon Leonard, fought passionately to keep it alive, arguing that audiences needed time to appreciate the show's more sophisticated approach. When the network suggested significant format changes as a condition of renewal, Van Dyke reportedly reached his breaking point. Dick actually said he would walk away rather than compromise the show's integrity, revealed a colleague from that period. It wasn't a threat or negotiating tactic. He genuinely meant it. He said, "I'd rather be unemployed than do something I don't believe in." For someone with a young family to support, that took real courage. The network ultimately renewed the show without demanding major changes, largely due to the intervention of producer Sheldon Leonard, who convinced them to give it another chance. The Dick Van Dyke Show went on to find its audience and run for 5 successful seasons, winning 15 Emmy Awards and establishing a template for sophisticated sitcoms that continues to influence television today. For Van Dyke, however, the battle left a lasting impression about the tension between art and commerce in television. Years later, he would reflect on this period with a mixture of pride and lingering frustration, telling an interviewer, "They didn't believe in us until it was almost too late. In the beginning, we had to fight for every show. I'm grateful. They eventually saw what we were trying to do, but I've never forgotten how close we came to losing something really special because it wasn't immediately commercial." This willingness to stand firm for his artistic principles, even at potential personal cost, reveals a side of Van Dyke that his public persona often obscures. Beneath the affable exterior lies a performer with deep convictions about his craft, and the courage to defend those convictions even against powerful opposition. Chim, 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 chim. Number 3. Julie Andrews manufactured magic on the Mary Poppins set. Few on-screen partnerships appear more natural and joyful than Dick Van Dyke and Julie Andrews in Disney's Mary Poppins. Their musical numbers together, particularly the iconic Jolly Holiday sequence, seem to capture pure, spontaneous delight, as if two performers have discovered in each other perfect artistic complements. The reality, according to those who worked on the 1964 production, was considerably more complex. While never descending into hostility, the relationship between Van Dyke and Andrews was reportedly marked by a subtle tension that both performers worked diligently to keep from affecting their on-screen chemistry. They were consummate professionals who respected each other's talents enormously, noted a member of the film's production team. But they came from very different performance traditions and never quite connected personally the way audiences assumed they did. What you see on screen isn't spontaneous friendship. It's two disciplined performers creating the illusion of effortless rapport. The source of the disconnection lay partly in their contrasting approaches to musical performance. Andrews, trained in classical voice and British theatrical tradition, brought precision and technical perfection to every note. Van Dyke, largely self-taught and coming from American television comedy, approached the musical numbers with less technical refinement, but an intuitive sense of physical expression and comedic timing. This difference manifested in subtle ways during rehearsals, where Andrews would occasionally appear mildly disconcerted by Van Dyke's more improvisational approach, while Van Dyke sometimes seemed intimidated by Andrews's flawless technique and formal training. I was working on the carousel horses sequence, and between takes, Dick made this little joke about Julie being practically perfect in every way, just like Mary Poppins. Everyone laughed, including Julie, but there was something in his tone, not resentment exactly, but a hint that her perfectionism made him self-conscious about his own more intuitive style. Later, he told me, "She never makes mistakes. I find that both impressive and a little terrifying." Assistant choreographer on Mary Poppins. The tension was further complicated by the film's notorious decision to cast Van Dyke as both Bert the Chimney Sweep and the elderly banker, Mr. Dawes Sr., giving him two major roles while Andrews played only the title character. Though Andrews never expressed any public displeasure with this arrangement, some crew members sensed her subtle disappointment that Van Dyke was given this additional showcase, while she remained confined to the more restrained title role. Despite these underlying tensions, both performers maintained absolute professionalism throughout production, never allowing their personal disconnect to affect their work. Director Robert Stevenson was reportedly so concerned about preserving their on-screen chemistry that he deliberately scheduled their most important scenes together early in the production schedule, before any potential tensions could develop or deep. The strategy worked brilliantly. The finished film showcases a partnership that appears completely natural and joyful, with no hint of the careful professional management that created it. Audiences then and now are enchanted by the apparent, perfect harmony between the two stars exactly as intended. In subsequent years, Van Dyke and Andrews maintained cordial professional respect, but never developed the close friendship that fans often assumed they must have. They appeared together at Disney events and Mary Poppins anniversaries when required, always with warm public interactions that gave no hint of their more complicated private dynamic. Van Dyke has occasionally alluded to this reality in interviews, once telling a reporter with characteristic tact, "Julie is extraordinary, one of the most gifted performers I've ever worked with. We each took a different path to get there, but we both wanted the audience to experience something magical." What he didn't say, but people who knew him well knew, was that the magic wasn't natural chemistry, but rather professional discipline. This carefully managed relationship shows us a lot about Van Dyke as a person. His unwavering dedication to the experience of the audience over his own comfort or ego. Even if he had doubts about his relationship with Andrews behind closed doors, he never let them get in the way of the happy illusion that generations of watchers have loved. A sign of the efficiency that has been his trademark throughout his career. That messed it up. The second one is Jim Carrey. The gap between generations. Over the years, comedy has changed, and Dick Van Dyke saw new acts become famous with styles that were very different from the way he did things. Jim Carrey was the person who best showed this change. In the 1990s, his crazy energy and extreme, physical comedy were a fascinating contrast to Van Dyke's more measured and exact performance style. Van Dyke never said anything bad about Carrey in public, but people close to him say that the elder statesman of physical comedy privately had doubts about what he saw as the younger performer's over-the-top approach. This created a symbolic, generational divide that showed a lot about Van Dyke's own comedic philosophy. A longtime friend remembered that Dick would watch Cars movies with an interesting mix of respect and discomfort. He would praise the amazing physical skill and dedication. Then he would shake his head and say something like, "He's trying too hard to be funny instead of just being funny." It wasn't jealousy. It was a fundamental difference in philosophy about how comedy should work. Van Dyke's physical comedy was always based on characters and stories, while Carrey's more extreme facial contortions and wild energy were more about shock value. It was said that Van Dyke was concerned that Carr's style took comedy away from the human link that he had always thought was important to the art form. To my question, "What does Dick think of Jim Carrey?" he replied in a very polite way that, "Different styles for different times." But then he added almost to himself, "I always believed you didn't need to hit the audience over the head to make them laugh. The best comedy comes from truth, not exaggeration." It wasn't a criticism exactly, more like concern from a master craftsman seeing his field move in a direction he didn't entirely understand. Television director who worked with Van Dyke in the 1990s. This philosophical difference came into sharper focus when both performers were considered for a major comedy film in the late 1990s. Though they would have played different roles rather than competing for the same part, Van Dyke reportedly declined further consideration after learning of Carrey's involvement, telling his agent he didn't think their styles would mesh effectively on screen. It wasn't personal. Dick had never even met Jim, clarified someone familiar with the situation. It was purely artistic. He just didn't see how his more subtle character-based approach could exist in the same film as Jim's more extreme style, without creating a jarring tonal disconnect. What makes this dynamic particularly poignant is that both men share remarkable physical gifts and precise control over their bodies as comedic instruments. In another era, they might have recognized each other as kindred spirits. Instead, they came to represent different chapters in comedy's evolution. Van Dyke embodying a more restrained, universally accessible approach, and Carrey pushing the boundaries of how far physical comedy could go. The irony, of course, is that both performers have shown considerable range beyond their signature styles. Van Dyke could be explosively energetic when material demanded it, while Carrey has demonstrated subtle dramatic depth in films like The Truman Show and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Yet their public images and Van Dyke's private assessment remained largely defined by their most distinctive comedic approaches. In recent years, as Carrey has stepped back from his most extreme comedic performances, and Van Dyke has gained perspective from his remarkable longevity, the symbolic divide between them has perhaps narrowed. Still, this quiet artistic disagreement reveals something essential about Van Dyke's views on his craft. His belief that the most enduring comedy comes not from pushing boundaries for their own sake, but from finding the universal human truth in even the most physical humor. Here it is, Mel. $1,000 worth of hair. What am I supposed to do with it? Number 1. Carl Reiner. Creative tension behind the scenes. Of all the professional relationships in Dick Van Dyke's long career, none was more significant or more complex than his partnership with Carl Reiner, the creative genius who created the Dick Van Dyke Show and played a pivotal role in shaping the performer's legacy. While their collaboration produced one of television's most perfect sitcoms, it also generated a creative tension that, while never erupting into outright conflict, revealed fundamental differences in their comedic sensibilities and moral boundaries. The seeds of this tension were present from the beginning. Reiner, a brilliant writer and performer whose comedy often pushed boundaries, had originally created the show as a vehicle for himself called Head of the Family. When that pilot failed to sell, producer Sheldon Leonard suggested recasting with Van Dyke in the lead, bringing together two talents with overlapping but distinct visions of what comedy could and should be. Carl was a comedy revolutionary who wanted to bring real life to the sitcom form, including some of its edgier aspects, explained a writer who worked on the show. Dick shared that desire for authenticity, but had firmer boundaries around taste and tone. He believed comedy could be both realistic and wholesome, that you didn't need to push limits to be funny or relevant. This philosophical difference manifested in regular discussions about script content during the show's 5-year run. Van Dyke, while never demanding changes, would occasionally express concern about dialogue or situations that he felt pushed beyond family-friendly boundaries. Reiner, respectful of his star's perspective, but committed to his own creative vision, would sometimes push back. They never argued. Both were too professional for that. But there were these fascinating conversations where Dick would gently suggest, "A line might be a bit much for our audience," and Carl would explain why he thought it was important to include. You could see them negotiating this middle ground between Carl's edge and Dick's warmth. That creative tension is part of what made the show so special. It had both perspectives. Script supervisor from the Dick Van Dyke Show. One particular point of ongoing negotiation concerned references to alcohol and Rob Petrie's drinking habits. Reiner, drawing from real life and contemporary adult comedy, initially wrote the character as a more regular drinker. Van Dyke, concerned about the message this might send and uncomfortable with glorifying alcohol consumption, advocated for a more moderate approach. The result was a compromise. Rob Petrie enjoyed the occasional drink, but never to excess. A middle ground between Reiner's realism and Van Dyke's responsibility. Similar discussions surrounded the physical relationship between Rob and Laura Petrie. The famous twin beds were a network requirement, but beyond that obvious limitation, Reiner often wanted to push the envelope of what could be implied about the couple's intimate life. Van Dyke, while never prudish, preferred keeping such elements more subtle, believing the show could acknowledge the couple's attraction without making it a focus. Carl liked pushing limits. "I liked keeping things warm," Van Dyke would later say about their creative partnership, a diplomatic acknowledgement of the tension that had helped define one of television's most successful collaborations. What made their relationship work despite these differences was the deep mutual respect that underpinned their occasional disagreements. Reiner recognized Van Dyke's extraordinary talent and understood that his star's warmth and likability were essential to making the show's sometimes sophisticated content accessible to a broad audience. Van Dyke, in turn, trusted Reiner's creative brilliance and appreciated how his more boundary-pushing instincts kept the show from becoming saccharine or simplistic. In the decades following the show, their friendship remained strong, though the same creative differences occasionally resurfaced in discussions about potential reunions or special episodes. When Reiner passed away in 2020 at age 98, Van Dyke's tribute was both heartfelt and revealing. Carl was brilliant, but what made him truly special was his willingness to listen and collaborate, even when we saw things different. This nuanced, creative partnership marked by tension but never conflict, by difference but never division, represents the most significant and complex relationship of Van Dyke's professional life. It reminds us that the best creative collaborations aren't always the easiest ones, and that the tension between different comedic visions can sometimes produce work that neither partner could have created alone. The principles behind the tensions. Looking across Dick Van Dyke's 6 most significant professional tensions. From his philosophical differences with Carl Reiner to his lingering resentment of an early critic, a pattern emerges that reveals much about the man behind the joyful public persona. These weren't random conflicts or petty grievances, but expressions of deeply held principles about entertainment, professionalism, and personal integrity. What's particularly revealing is how consistently Van Dyke's tensions centered on artistic, rather than personal concerns. His occasional frustrations with colleagues like Julie Andrews or Walter Matthau weren't about ego or competition, but about different approaches to performance and preparation. His philosophical divide with Jim Carrey wasn't personal animosity, but genuine concern about comedy's evolution. Even his most direct conflict, the battle with CBS executives over his show's direction, centered on artistic integrity rather than contract demands or star treat. Dick has always been guided by a clear set of principles about his work. Observed a director who collaborated with him on multiple projects. He believes entertainment should uplift rather than tear down. That comedy can be funny without being mean or crude. That performers have a responsibility to their audience. When he encountered people or situations that challenged those principles, that's when you'd see the steel beneath the smile. This perspective helps explain why Van Dyke, unlike many stars of his stature, has remarkably few industry enemies or lingering feuds. His occasional tensions weren't about personality clashes, but about specific creative or professional issues. Once those issues were resolved, whether through compromise or simply moving on to different projects, Van Dyke rarely harbored personal resentment. What remained consistent throughout these various tensions was Van Dyke's unwavering commitment to his core values: professionalism, preparation, accessibility, and a fundamental optimism about entertainment's potential to bring joy rather than cynicism. When these values were challenged, whether by Matthau's unpredictability, network executives, commercial concerns, or Carr's more extreme approach, that's when the famously affable performer would reveal a firmer, more resolute side. The legacy of principal joy. At 98, Dick Van Dyke has achieved something remarkable in entertainment. A career spanning nearly 80 years without scandal, bitter feuds, or public meltdowns. The occasional tensions and creative differences that did arise, now acknowledged with the perspective that only a century of life can provide, never defined his journey, but instead highlighted the principles that guided it. What's extraordinary about Dick isn't that he never had conflicts, noted a longtime colleague. It's how he handled them with dignity, restraint, and a consistent focus on the work itself, rather than personal grievances. He didn't fight to protect his ego. He fought to protect his values and his connection with the audience. This approach has served Van Dyke well, allowing him to maintain both his professional standing and his personal reputation through decades of industry evolution. While other stars of his era often became bitter about changing tastes or faded into irrelevance, Van Dyke adapted without compromising his core principles, finding new audiences with each generation, while remaining true to his fundamental belief in entertainment that brings joy rather than cynicism. His occasional tensions with figures like Reiner, Andrews, or Carrey ultimately reveal not pettiness, but perspective. The hard-earned wisdom of an artist who understood that maintaining certain standards sometimes requires standing firm, even when that firmness might be misinterpreted as inflexibility. As he approaches his centennial, Van Dyke's willingness to acknowledge these moments of tension represents not a tarnishing of his legacy, but an enriching of it, adding depth and humanity to a public image that might otherwise seem too perfect to be real. The man who danced on rooftops and turned physical comedy into an art form wasn't just a natural talent, but a disciplined professional whose warmth and joy were choices renewed daily, even when circumstances might have justified a less generous response. He danced through decades of television and film, bringing joy to generations with his physical comedy and irrepressible warmth. But as Dick Van Dyke approaches his 100th birthday, his willingness to acknowledge the occasional shadows behind his sunny public persona reveals something even more valuable than his legendary talent: his humanity. From his creative tension with Carl Reiner to his philosophical differences with Jim Carrey, from his professional disconnect with Julie Andrews to his battles with CBS executives, Van Dyke's rare moments of conflict illuminate not flaws, but principles. The clear artistic and personal values that guided his remarkable journey through entertainment history. What makes these revelations so compelling isn't that they diminish Van Dyke's sterling reputation, but that they add dimension to it. The man who made comedy look effortless was actually working incredibly hard, not just at his performances, but at maintaining the optimism and integrity that defined his approach to entertainment. The smile that seemed so natural was sometimes a professional choice made despite creative frustrations or philosophical differences. Perhaps that's the most inspiring aspect of Van Dyke's legacy: the recognition that bringing joy to others isn't always easy, that maintaining principles sometimes requires quiet determination, and that the most enduring entertainers aren't those without conflicts, but those who handle inevitable tensions with grace and perspective. As we celebrate this living legend's extraordinary contributions to entertainment, these glimpses behind the scenes don't diminish our appreciation. They deepen it, revealing the thoughtful, principled artist behind the seemingly effortless charm that has delighted audiences for nearly a century. If you've enjoyed this more nuanced look at one of entertainment's most beloved figures, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Legacy News for more stories that explore the full humanity of your favorite stars. We're dedicated to honoring their legacies, not just through celebration, but through understanding the principles and occasional struggles that shaped their remarkable journeys. If you believe that maintaining your values sometimes requires quiet strength, hit that like button and let us know in the comments which aspect of Dick Van Dyke's principled approach to entertainment resonates most with you. Are there other beloved performers whose fuller stories you'd like us to explore? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next